Welcome to Midnight Whispers, a place where the Yukon silence feels heavier than the cold itself, and every shadow seems to watch back. Up here, people vanish without sound. Highways stretch into nothingness, and abandoned mining towns echo with voices no one alive remembers. These stories come from real travelers, rangers, and locals who swear they saw something they shouldn't. If you're new, maybe subscribe. Not for me, for yourself. It's safer when you're not listening alone. Now, keep your eyes open. The Yukon doesn't like to be ignored. Story 1. Vanishing of the Dawson City Gold Train. Yukon, this frozen ghost mystery. I still hear the whistle at night, even though I know that train has been gone for almost 60 years. My name does not matter anymore, because what I found in the Yukon winter changed me in ways I cannot explain to anyone who was not there. This is the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to me, and I need to tell someone before the darkness takes what is left of my mind. It started 3 months ago when I took a job as a railway inspector for the old Yukon line between Whitehorse and Dawson City. Most people do not even know there are still tracks up there, buried under snow and time. The company hired me to survey a 100-mile stretch of abandoned rail, checking for structural damage before they decided whether to restore the route or tear it down completely. Good pay, they said. Easy work, they promised. Just you in the wilderness for a few weeks. I should have known better when the hiring manager would not look me in the eye. The first thing that felt wrong was the silence. I have been in remote places before. Deserts, forests, mountains. But the Yukon in deep winter is different. The cold does not just bite your skin, it swallows sound itself. My footsteps on the snow, my breathing, even my heartbeat seemed muffled, like the world was wrapped in something thick and suffocating. The darkness up there is not normal darkness either. It is heavy, almost solid, pressing against you from all sides. I set up base camp in an old railway maintenance shed about 40 miles north of Whitehorse. The structure was barely standing, but it had a wood stove and 4 walls, which was more than I would have out on the open tundra. The locals in Whitehorse had been strange when I mentioned where I was heading. An old man at the supply store actually grabbed my arm when I told him my route. "You are going near the vanishing stretch," he said, his fingers cold through my jacket. "Do not go out after dark. Do not follow the lights. And if you hear the whistle, do not look for the train." I laughed it off then. Small town superstition, I thought. Ghost stories to scare outsiders. But his face was serious, almost desperate. And when I pulled away, I saw something in his eyes that I recognize now as genuine fear. The first week was normal enough, just brutal cold and endless white. I spent my days walking the tracks, taking measurements, checking the rails for frost damage and structural weakness. The railway cut through some of the most isolated country I have ever seen. Frozen rivers, dead forests, mountains that looked like broken teeth against the gray sky. I saw 1 caribou in 7 days. No birds, no other animals, just the wind and the snow and that suffocating silence. On the 8th night, I heard the whistle for the first time. It came around 2 in the morning, distant but clear, cutting through the darkness like a scream. I sat up in my sleeping bag, breath freezing in my lungs, listening. The sound was unmistakable, a train whistle, old and haunting, echoing across the frozen wasteland. But there were no active trains on this line. There had not been regular service here since the 1960s. I told myself it was the wind. Strange acoustics in the mountains. My mind playing tricks in the isolation. I pulled the sleeping bag over my head and tried to ignore the way my hands were shaking. The whistle came again the next night, and the night after that. Always around 2 in the morning. Always from the north, deeper into the route toward Dawson City. On the 11th day, I found the marker. It was just a small wooden post beside the tracks, nearly buried in snow. I almost walked past it, but something made me stop and dig it out. The wood was old, rotted, but I could still read the carved numbers. Mile 47. And below that, scratched roughly into the timber. Here. My hands went numb, and it was not from the cold. I checked my maps that night by lamplight, cross-referencing every survey document the company had given me. Mile 47 was part of what the locals called the vanishing stretch. A 23-mile section of track between 2 maintenance stations where, in January of 1965, a supply train simply disappeared. The official report said mechanical failure, probably a derailment into one of the frozen rivers. But they never found wreckage. No bodies, no cargo, 6 men and 40 tons of equipment vanished in a stretch of track that should have taken less than an hour to travel. Search parties combed the area for weeks. They found nothing. The case went cold. The railway shut down most operations, and the locals started talking about the ice spirits, ancient things that lived in the deep Yukon winter, hungry and patient. I am not a superstitious man. I have a degree in engineering. I believe in physics, in rational explanations, in cause and effect. But standing there in that shed, reading about men who vanished without a trace on the exact route I was surveying, I felt something I had not felt since I was a child afraid of the dark. I felt hunted. The next morning, I decided to survey mile 47 in daylight. I needed to see it, to prove to myself it was just another stretch of old track. The sky was the color of dirty ice, and the temperature had dropped to 30 below. My breath crystallized instantly in the air. Every step crunched too loud in the silence. When I reached mile 47, I found the tracks were different. The rails were darker there, almost black, and the snow around them had a strange texture, like it had melted and refrozen in patterns that made no sense. I knelt down and touched one of the rails with my gloved hand. It was warm. Impossible. The metal should have been frozen solid, cold enough to burn skin. But the rail was warm, almost hot, radiating heat into the frozen air. I pulled my hand back and saw frost melting where I had touched it, running in tiny rivulets down the dark metal. That was when I noticed the smell. Burning coal, oil, something else underneath. Something organic and wrong, like meat left too long in the sun. The smell was faint but unmistakable, drifting on the wind from somewhere further up the tracks. I should have left then. Every instinct was screaming at me to turn around, to get back to the shed, to call the company and quit this job immediately. But I am stubborn, and I was angry at myself for being scared. So I followed the tracks north, deeper into the vanishing stretch. The smell got stronger. The rails stayed warm, and after about a mile, I saw the lights. They were dancing in the distance, blue and green and pale white, floating above the tracks like frozen fire. I had heard of aurora borealis, northern lights, but these were different. They moved with purpose, swirling and pulsing in patterns that hurt to watch, and they stayed low, hugging the ground instead of spreading across the sky. I walked toward them, hypnotized. The lights grew brighter as I approached, and I started to hear sounds underneath the wind. Metal grinding on metal, steam hissing, voices calling out in words I could not understand. Then I saw the train. It was not solid. It flickered in and out of existence, like an old film projection, there and not there at the same time. But I could see the shape of it, a locomotive and 6 cars, exactly matching the description of the supply train that vanished in 1965. The engine was running, steam pouring from its stack into the frozen air, and I could see movement in the windows, shadows of people going about their business like nothing was wrong. The whistle blew, so close and loud it felt like my skull would crack. I fell to my knees, hands over my ears, screaming without sound. And then I saw them. The figures in the train windows were not shadows. They were people, or had been once. Their faces were pressed against the glass, mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide and desperate. They were clawing at the windows, trying to break through, and I realized with a horror that made my stomach twist that they could see me. One of them, a man in a conductor's uniform, mouthed words I could read. Help us. Still here, trapped, the train lurched forward on the tracks, moving in complete silence except for that terrible whistle, and I understood then what the locals meant about the ice spirits. This was not a haunting. This was a prison. Something had taken that train in 1965 and frozen it between moments, trapped in a loop of time and cold and darkness. The men inside were still alive, still conscious, still experiencing every second of the last 60 years in that frozen hell. I ran. I do not remember the trip back to the shed. I just remember running until my lungs burned and my legs gave out, falling in the snow, crawling the last 100 yards to that rotting building. I locked the door, fed the stove until it was roaring, and sat in the corner with my rifle across my lap, shaking so hard I thought my bones would break. The whistle blew all night, closer and closer, until it sounded like it was right outside my door. I left the next morning, abandoning my equipment, my survey, everything. I drove back to Whitehorse without stopping, reported mechanical problems with my gear, and quit via email a week later. The company did not fight it. I think they were relieved. But I cannot escape what I saw out there. I dream about those faces in the windows, still screaming, still trapped. I wake up at 2 in the morning to the sound of a whistle that is not there. And sometimes, when the temperature drops and the night is particularly dark, I see lights dancing at the edge of my vision, blue and green and hungry. The locals were right. There are things in the Yukon winter that do not follow the rules of our world. The vanishing stretch is real, and the train is still out there, caught in something we were never meant to understand. I looked up the names of the crew that vanished in 1965. 6 men, all with families, all declared dead after the investigation closed. But I know the truth now. They are not dead. They are still riding that train through an endless frozen nightmare, and they will be riding it long after I am gone. Last week, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a piece of old, rotted wood with numbers carved into it, mile 47. And scratched below, in handwriting I recognized from my own survey notes, "Your turn soon." I do not know what that means. I do not want to know. But every night at 2 in the morning, I hear the whistle getting closer. Story 2. What happened at the Carcross suicide shack? A true crime and poltergeist case. I still cannot explain what I saw in that cabin. And honestly, I am not sure I want to. The smell alone should have been enough to turn me around, but fear has a way of pulling you forward when every instinct screams to run. This happened 3 months ago in the wilderness near Carcross, and I have not slept properly since. What started as a weekend hiking trip turned into the most terrifying encounter of my life, and I need to tell someone before it drives me completely insane. Let me start at the beginning. I had been planning this trip for weeks. Carcross sits in the Yukon Territory, just across the Alaskan border, a small isolated town surrounded by endless forest and mountains. I grew up in Montana, so the wilderness never scared me. I had done dozens of solo hikes, spent nights in my tent listening to wolves howl in the distance, and never felt anything but peace out there. But this time was different. This time, I found something that was never supposed to be found. The locals in Carcross warned me before I left. I stopped at a small diner for breakfast, and the waitress, an older woman with gray hair pulled back tight, asked where I was headed. When I told her I was taking the northern trail toward Bennett Lake, her face went pale. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a whisper, and told me to stay on the main path. She said there was something out there that moved, something that should not exist anymore. A shack, she called it. The suicide shack. She said a hermit died there back in the 70s under horrifying circumstances, and ever since, hikers reported seeing the cabin in places it had never been before. She told me if I saw it, I should turn around immediately and never look back. I smiled politely and thanked her, but inside I dismissed it as small-town superstition. Every rural area has its ghost stories, its urban legends meant to scare tourists and keep people from wandering too far off the beaten path. I paid for my meal, grabbed my pack, and headed out into the crisp morning air. The sky was overcast, a thick blanket of gray clouds pressing down on the treetops, and the temperature hovered just above freezing. Perfect hiking weather. The first few hours were exactly what I expected. The trail wound through dense pine forests, the ground covered in a soft carpet of needles that muffled my footsteps. Birds called from the branches above, and occasionally I would spot a squirrel darting up a tree trunk. The air smelled clean, sharp, like winter was not far behind. I felt good, strong, alive. But around noon, something changed. The forest grew silent. Not the peaceful kind of quiet you get when you stop to rest, but an oppressive, unnatural silence that pressed against my eardrums. No birds, no wind, no rustling in the underbrush. Just a thick, suffocating stillness that made my skin crawl. I stopped walking and stood perfectly still, listening, trying to figure out what had changed. That was when I smelled it. At first, it was faint, just a hint of something rotten carried on the breeze. But within seconds, it grew stronger, a nauseating stench of decay and filth that made my eyes water. I covered my nose and mouth with my sleeve, scanning the trees around me, trying to locate the source. Dead animal, I thought. Maybe a moose or a bear that had died nearby. But the smell was wrong. It was not just rot. There was something chemical about it, something sharp and acrid that burned the back of my throat. That was when I saw the shack. It sat about 50 yards off the trail, nestled between two massive spruce trees like it had grown there naturally. The structure was small, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, with walls made of rough, weathered logs that looked like they had been standing for decades. The roof sagged in the middle, covered in moss and patches of old snow. A single window, dark and empty, stared out at me like a dead eye. The door hung slightly open, creaking softly even though there was no wind. Every part of me wanted to turn around. The rational part of my brain screamed that this was wrong, that I should get back on the trail and keep moving. But curiosity is a dangerous thing. I told myself I just wanted to see what was causing this smell, maybe confirm it was an animal carcass and nothing more. I approached slowly, my boots crunching softly on the frozen ground, my heart hammering in my chest. The closer I got, the stronger the smell became. It was overwhelming now, a thick, choking stench that made me gag. I pulled my shirt up over my nose, breathing through my mouth, and stepped up to the door. It was covered in deep scratches, long gouges in the wood that looked like they had been made by claws or fingernails. Some of them were old, weathered and gray, but others looked fresh, the wood inside still pale and exposed. I pushed the door open with my boot, and it swung inward with a low, agonized creak. The interior was pitch black despite the daylight outside, as if the darkness inside was something solid, something that refused to let the light in. I pulled out my flashlight and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the shadows like a knife. What I saw inside made my blood turn to ice. The shack was empty except for a single wooden chair sitting in the center of the room. The chair faced the door, and on the seat was a pile of old, stained clothing. But it was not the chair or the clothes that froze me in place. It was the walls. Every surface, from floor to ceiling, was covered in writing. Words scratched into the wood with something sharp, layer upon layer of frantic, desperate scrawling that overlapped and tangled together until it was almost impossible to read. I stepped inside, my flashlight shaking in my hand, and tried to make sense of the words. Most of it was incoherent, just fragments of sentences repeated over and over. Cold, so cold, need warmth, please, warmth, burning, freezing, help me, cold, warmth, please. But scattered among the repetition were other phrases, darker things that made my stomach turn. They will not let me leave. I hear them in the walls. They want in. I let them in. God forgive me. I let them in. I backed toward the door, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. And that was when I heard it. A whisper, soft and wet, like someone speaking through a mouthful of water. It came from somewhere behind me, inside the shack, even though I knew I was alone. Warmth. I spun around, my flashlight beam sweeping across the room, but there was nothing there. Just the chair, just the walls covered in that horrible writing. My hands were trembling so badly I almost dropped the flashlight. I needed to get out. I needed to leave right now. But then the door slammed shut. The sound was deafening in the small space, and I lunged for the handle, yanking on it with all my strength. It would not budge. The wood was swollen, jammed tight in the frame, and no matter how hard I pulled, it would not open. Panic flooded through me, hot and suffocating, and I started pounding on the door with my fists, shouting for help even though I knew there was no one around for miles. That was when the temperature dropped. It happened so fast I could see my breath misting in the air, thick white clouds that hung in front of my face. The cold was not normal. It was bone deep, the kind of freezing cold that makes your joints ache and your teeth chatter uncontrollably. I stumbled backward, away from the door, and my flashlight flickered. Once, twice, then it went out completely, plunging me into absolute darkness. I could hear something moving in the room with me. Slow, dragging footsteps across the wooden floor. The sound of breathing, ragged and wet, like lungs filled with fluid. And then the whispers started again, coming from all directions at once, surrounding me, pressing in on me from every side. Warmth, please, so cold, need warmth, let me in, let me in. I pressed myself against the wall, my heart slamming against my ribs so hard I thought it would burst. My flashlight was dead, and the darkness was so complete I could not see my own hands in front of my face. I could feel something in the room with me now, something that radiated cold like a furnace radiates heat. It was close, right in front of me. I could feel its breath on my face, icy and rancid, and I knew with absolute certainty that if it touched me, I would die. I do not know how long I stood there, frozen in terror, listening to those whispers. It could have been minutes or hours. Time had no meaning in that place. But eventually, the whispers faded, the cold lifted slightly, and I heard the door creak open behind me. I did not wait to see what had opened it. I ran. I burst out of that shack and into the forest, my legs pumping, branches whipping across my face, my lungs burning. I did not stop running until I reached the main trail, And even then, I kept moving, jogging, walking, anything to put distance between myself and that place. I did not look back. I could not. When I finally made it back to Carcross, the sun was setting, and I was shaking so badly I could barely stand. I went straight to the diner, found the same waitress, and told her everything. She just nodded, like she had heard it all before, and said, "You are lucky. Most people who go inside do not come back out." I asked her what happened to the hermit, the one who died there in the 70s. She hesitated, then told me the story. His name was Thomas Carver, and he lived alone in that shack for nearly a decade. In the winter of 1973, a group of hunters found him dead inside. He had frozen to death, but the strange part was that there was a fire burning in the stove when they found him. A roaring fire. The cabin should have been warm, but his body was frozen solid, covered in frost, like he had been left outside in a blizzard. And the walls, they were covered in the same writing I had seen, the same desperate pleas for warmth. The authorities ruled it a suicide, though no one could explain how he had frozen to death in a heated cabin. They boarded the place up and tried to forget about it, but the shack did not stay boarded up. Hikers started reporting sightings in different locations, miles away from where it was supposed to be. And everyone who went inside described the same thing. The cold, the whispers, the feeling of something hungry and desperate trying to get out. I left Carcross the next morning and drove straight home. I have not been back. I have not been hiking since. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and I am lying in bed trying to sleep, I hear it. That same wet whisper, so faint I almost think I am imagining it. Warmth. And I know, deep in my bones, that whatever was in that shack is still out there, still moving, still searching. And I think it followed me home. Story 3 to 411. The disappearance of the hiker on the Chilcot Trail. I found the backpack on my third day searching for him, and what I saw on that camera still keeps me awake at night, staring at my bedroom ceiling, wondering if he is still out there somewhere, watching, waiting, terrified beyond all human understanding. My name is Marcus Webb, and in the summer of 2007, I was a search and rescue coordinator for the National Park Service in Alaska. I had spent 15 years pulling lost hikers out of the wilderness, talking down panicked tourists, and recovering bodies from crevasses and river gorges. I thought I had seen everything the backcountry could throw at a person. I thought I understood fear. I was wrong about both. The call came in on a Tuesday morning in late June. A hiker named David Archer had failed to check in at his scheduled pickup point along the Chilcot Trail. The Chilcot is not some forgotten path through unmapped wilderness. It is one of the most traveled routes in Alaska, a historic trail used during the gold rush, walked by thousands of people every summer. It has ranger stations, established campsites, and clear markers every quarter mile. People do just vanish on the Chilcot Trail. David was 42 years old, an experienced outdoorsman from Colorado with over 20 years of hiking under his belt. He had summited 14ers, backpacked through Patagonia, and spent weeks alone in the Colorado Rockies. His itinerary was precise. He planned a solo 4-day hike from Daya to Bennett Lake, a route he had researched for months. Everything about David Archer screamed competence and preparation. We assembled a search team within hours. 6 of us, all experienced trackers, spread out along the trail in both directions from his last known checkpoint. The weather had been perfect, clear skies and mild temperatures, no storms or unusual conditions that might explain a disappearance. The trail was busy that week. Dozens of hikers had passed through the same area. Nobody reported seeing anything unusual, no signs of distress, no wildlife encounters, nothing. On the first day, we found nothing. On the second day, we expanded the search grid, bringing in dogs and a helicopter for aerial reconnaissance. The dogs seemed confused, circling the same areas repeatedly, whining and pulling their handlers in conflicting directions. The helicopter spotted nothing from above. It was as if David had simply ceased to exist somewhere between mile marker 17 and mile marker 23. Then, on the third day, I found his backpack. It was sitting on top of a boulder roughly 50 feet off the main trail, positioned in a small clearing surrounded by dense spruce trees. The backpack wasn't hidden or concealed. It was placed deliberately, almost ceremonially, centered perfectly on the flat surface of the rock. The sight of it sent an immediate chill down my spine, something instinctive and primal that told me this was wrong, deeply wrong. I called out to the rest of the team and approached slowly. The backpack was a dark green Osprey, expensive and well-maintained, exactly the kind of gear an experienced hiker would carry. It wasn't damaged, wasn't torn or scattered. It looked like someone had simply set it down with care and walked away. I circled the boulder twice before touching it, scanning the surrounding forest for any sign of David or an explanation for why his pack would be here, arranged so deliberately. When I finally opened it, everything was still inside. His sleeping bag, cooking supplies, first aid kit, water filtration system, food rations, maps, and compass. Everything a person would need to survive in the wilderness. The only thing that seemed unusual was that all of his supplies were organized with an almost obsessive precision, each item packed tightly and efficiently, as if he had repacked everything just before abandoning it. Then I found the camera. It was a digital Canon, fairly high-end for 2007, tucked into a padded side pocket. The battery was still charged. I turned it on, and my hand started shaking before I even viewed the first image. There were 43 photos on the camera. The first 20 were exactly what you would expect from a hiking trip. Scenic mountain vistas, close-ups of wildflowers, a self-portrait of David grinning at the trailhead with his backpack on. He looked happy, healthy, excited. The timestamps showed these photos were taken over the first 2 days of his hike. Then something changed. Photo 21 was taken on the morning of his third day, roughly 12 hours before he was supposed to check in at the next ranger station. It showed the trail ahead, nothing unusual, just trees and rocks and dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy. But something about the image felt off, a subtle wrongness I couldn't quite identify at first. I stared at it for a long time before I realized what it was. The shadows were going in the wrong direction, angled in a way that didn't match the position of the sun. Photo 22 was taken 10 minutes later according to the timestamp. It showed the same stretch of trail, but now there was something in the distance, barely visible through the trees. A dark shape, humanoid but wrong somehow, too tall and too thin, standing motionless about 100 yards ahead. The image was slightly blurred, as if David's hands had been shaking when he took it. Photo 23 was a close-up of that same shape, zoomed in as far as the camera would allow. It was still too distant to make out details, but I could see it wasn't a bear or a moose or any animal I recognized. It had the general outline of a person, but the proportions were all wrong, limbs too long, posture too rigid. It was just standing there, motionless, facing toward the camera. The next 15 photos were all taken over the following 3 hours, each one showing the same figure, always at roughly the same distance, always motionless, always watching. David had been walking, presumably trying to continue his hike, and this thing had been following him, maintaining a constant distance, never getting closer but never falling behind. In some photos it was visible through breaks in the trees, in others it was just a shadow at the edge of the frame, a darkness that didn't belong. Then the photos changed again, and this is where the real horror began. Photo 39 was a self-portrait of David, but not like the cheerful shot from the trailhead. His face filled the entire frame, eyes wide with terror, mouth open in what might have been a scream or a gasp. The photo was taken at arm's length, the angle awkward and hurried. But here is what made my blood run cold. In the background, barely visible over his shoulder, was the forest. And standing in that forest, perhaps 20 feet behind him, was the dark figure. Closer now, much closer, but David wasn't holding the camera. I know he wasn't holding it because both of his hands were visible in the photo, raised in front of him in a defensive posture, fingers spread wide. Someone or something else had taken that picture. Someone or something had been standing right in front of him, close enough to capture his terrified face in perfect focus, while that dark shape loomed behind him. The next 3 photos were all the same. David's face, frozen in fear, taken from slightly different angles, each one showing him in a different location in the forest, each one showing that dark figure somewhere in the background, sometimes closer, sometimes at a distance, always present, always watching. The timestamps indicated these photos were taken over a span of 6 hours, which meant David had been moving through the forest, running or hiding or trying to escape, while someone or something photographed his terror again and again and again. The final photo was taken at sunset according to the timestamp. It showed David one last time, but the image was dark and grainy, shot in low light. He was standing in a clearing I didn't recognize, surrounded by trees that seemed to press in from all sides. His face was slack now, eyes empty, no longer showing fear but something worse, something like resignation or acceptance. The dark figure was directly behind him in this photo, close enough that I could finally make out some details. It was tall, impossibly tall, at least 8 or 9 feet. Its body was elongated and skeletal, limbs too long and joints bending at angles that human joints don't bend. I couldn't make out a face in the darkness, just a smooth oval where a head should be. And it was touching David, one impossibly long hand resting on his shoulder, almost gently, almost affectionately. That was the last photo. After that, nothing. I stood there in that clearing for a long time, holding the camera, trying to process what I had just seen. The other members of the search team gathered around me, and I showed them the images in silence. Nobody spoke. Nobody wanted to say out loud what we were all thinking. This wasn't a bear attack or a fall or exposure or any of the 100 normal ways people die in the wilderness. This was something else, something that didn't fit into any framework we understood. We searched that area for another 5 days. We brought in cadaver dogs and thermal imaging equipment and expanded the search radius to over 10 square miles. We found nothing. No body, no clothes, no further evidence. It was as if David Archer had been erased from existence, leaving behind only his neatly arranged backpack and those horrifying images. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead due to unknown causes. The photos were logged as evidence, but nobody knew what to make of them. A few people suggested they were staged, some kind of hoax or art project, but that didn't explain where David went or why he would abandon all his supplies and disappear into the wilderness. Others whispered about wildlife they didn't want to name out loud, ancient stories passed down by indigenous peoples about things that lived in the deep forests, things that didn't like to be seen. I left the Park Service 6 months later. I told people it was time for a career change, that I wanted to be closer to family, normal explanations that people could accept. But the truth is I couldn't go back into those woods. I couldn't walk those trails knowing what might be out there, watching from the shadows, patient and silent and utterly inhuman. I still have copies of those photos. I studied them for hours, zooming in on every detail, trying to find some rational explanation. But there ISN T1, whatever was in those images, whatever followed David Archer through the forest and photographed his terror, it wasn't an animal and it wasn't human. Sometimes, late at night when I can sleep, I think about that last photo. I think about the way that thing, his hand was resting on David, his shoulder, almost gentle, almost tender. I think about the empty look in David, his eyes, the resignation, the acceptance. And I wonder what he saw in those final hours, what he learned about the world that made him stop running, stop fighting, and just stand there in the darkness, waiting for whatever came next. The Chilcot Trail is still open. Thousands of people hike it every year. The Park Service never closed it or issued any special warnings. Officially, David Archer's disappearance remains an unsolved mystery, just another statistic in the long list of people who vanish in the wilderness without explanation. But sometimes hikers report strange things on that stretch of trail between mile markers 17 and 23. Feelings of being watched, shadows moving in the peripheral vision, footsteps that don't quite match their own pace. Most of them laugh it off, blame it on exhaustion or imagination or the eerie isolation of the backcountry. I know better. I know that something walks those woods, something patient and cruel, something that watches and waits and chooses its moments with terrible precision. I know that David Archer wasn't the first person it found, and he won to be the last. And sometimes, on the darkest nights, I wonder if it is still taking pictures. Story 4. Whitehorse Hospital morgue incident, caught on security tape. The footage still exists, locked in a police evidence room in Whitehorse, and I'm the last person who will ever admit to watching it. My name is Michael Torres, and I worked as a night security guard at Whitehorse General Hospital from March to August of 1987. What I saw during those 5 months destroyed my marriage, ended my career, and left me with a fear of the dark so severe that I sleep with every light in my house burning. This is the most terrifying true story I have ever lived through, and I need someone to know what really happened before I lose my mind completely. The hospital hired me in early spring, right after the previous night guard quit without giving notice. The HR manager seemed desperate to fill the position, which should have been my first warning. Good jobs in Whitehorse were hard to find back then, and security work that paid this well usually had people lining up. But she hired me on the spot, barely asking any questions, just handed me a uniform and a ring of keys and told me to report at 11 that night. The building itself was old, built in 1952, all concrete and narrow hallways that seemed to go on forever. During the day it was busy enough, but after midnight the place became something else entirely. The fluorescent lights hummed too loud. The heating system made sounds like breathing in the walls. And there was a cold spot on the second floor, right outside the morgue, where the temperature dropped at least 20 degrees no matter what season it was. I noticed it my first night, walking my rounds at 1 a.m, checking doors and windows, making sure everything was locked down. When I reached the second floor hallway, my breath started fogging in the air. I could see frost forming on the corners of the windows. The thermostat on the wall read 72 degrees, but I was shivering so hard my teeth chattered. The morgue door was at the end of that hallway. Heavy steel-painted institutional green. It was always locked. I had a key, but I had been told during training that I should never go inside unless there was an emergency. The morgue had its own separate cooling system, the day supervisor explained, and sometimes it malfunctioned and leaked cold air into the hallway. Just walk past it quickly, he said. Do not worry about it. But standing there that first night, staring at that green door with frost creeping around its edges, I felt something I had not felt since childhood. Pure, instinctive fear, the kind that makes your stomach drop and your skin crawl, the kind that tells you something is very wrong. I walked past quickly, like he told me. I did not look back, but I felt watched the entire way down that hallway. And when I finally turned the corner, I swear I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, dragging footsteps. When I spun around, the hallway was empty. The next few weeks were quiet, just boring routine. I made my rounds every hour, checked the security monitors in my office on the first floor, drank too much coffee and read paperback westerns to stay awake. The hospital at night was creepy, sure, but it was manageable. Nurses worked the overnight shifts on the patient floors. Doctors came and went. I was never truly alone. Then I met Sarah. She was a nurse on the oncology ward, 3rd floor, and we started talking during my rounds. She was kind and tired and said she had been working at Whitehorse General for almost 15 years. One night in late April, I mentioned the cold spot outside the morgue. Her face changed immediately. She looked around to make sure we were alone, then stepped closer and lowered her voice. She told me about the cold man. Nurses had been seeing him since the early 80s, she said. A figure in old-fashioned clothes, mining gear from the gold rush era, standing at the foot of patients' beds in the middle of the night. He never moved, never spoke, just stood there, watching, until the nurse noticed him. Then he would fade away, like smoke, leaving the room freezing cold. Patients reported him too. They called him the cold man because the temperature would drop right before he appeared. Some patients said he touched them, that his hand felt like ice burning their skin. 3 people had died within hours of seeing him. I asked if she was serious. She looked me dead in the eyes and told me she had seen him herself, twice, and both times the patient in that room was dead by morning. The hospital administration knew about it, she said, but they refused to acknowledge it officially. Too many liability issues, too much risk of scaring patients and staff, so they just kept quiet and hoped it would go away. But it never did. That conversation changed everything. I started paying closer attention during my rounds, watching the shadows, listening for sounds that did not belong. And I started noticing things I had missed before. The security cameras on the second floor would glitch whenever I walked past the morgue. Static would fill the screens for a few seconds, then clear. It happened every single time. The cold spot grew larger. By May, the entire hallway was freezing, frost covering the walls, ice forming on the inside of the windows even though it was spring outside. And I started hearing the footsteps regularly, slow, dragging, always behind me when I was on the second floor. Always stopping when I stopped, always starting again when I moved. On June 3rd, I saw him for the first time. It was 2:30 in the morning. I was in my office reviewing the security tapes from earlier that evening, just routine procedure. The monitors showed empty hallways, quiet patient rooms, nothing unusual. Then I switched to camera 7, which covered the second floor hallway outside the morgue. A figure stood in the middle of the frame. He was tall, wearing old mining clothes, heavy canvas pants and a thick wool shirt, suspenders, boots caked in mud. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were completely black. No whites, no pupils, just solid black that seemed to absorb the light. He was staring directly at the camera. My heart stopped. I could not breathe. I could not move. I just sat there, frozen, watching this impossible thing on the monitor. He did not blink, did not shift, just stared with those horrible empty eyes. Then he smiled. His mouth opened way too wide, showing teeth that were brown and broken, and he turned slowly and walked straight into the morgue wall. Not through the door, into the solid concrete wall. And he disappeared. I ran out of my office and up to the second floor, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my flashlight. The hallway was freezing, my breath coming out in thick clouds. I checked the morgue door. Still locked. I pressed my ear against it and listened. Silence. I should have left. I should have walked away, finished my shift, and never come back. But I needed to know. I needed to see inside that morgue. I unlocked the door with trembling fingers and pushed it open. The smell hit me first. Not decay or chemicals, but cold. Pure, frozen cold that burned my lungs. The morgue was small. Just 6 steel drawers built into the wall and a single examination table in the center. Everything looked normal, clean, empty, except for the frost. It covered everything. The drawers, the table, the floor. Thick white frost that sparkled under the fluorescent lights. And in that frost, I saw footprints. They led from the back wall to the examination table, then stopped. Old boot prints, exactly like the ones miners would have worn 100 years ago. I backed out of that room so fast I tripped over my own feet. I slammed the door, locked it, and ran down the hallway without looking back. The next morning, I went to my supervisor and told him I was seeing things on the security tapes. I did not mention the figure. I just said the cameras were malfunctioning and someone needed to check them. He looked at me with an expression I could not read, something between pity and fear, and told me maintenance would take a look. They never did. Instead, 2 days later, the hospital director called me into his office. He was an older man, stern, the kind who did not tolerate nonsense. He asked me directly if I had been in the morgue. I said yes, that I thought I heard something and went to investigate. He leaned forward and told me that under no circumstances was I to enter the morgue again. It was off limits to security staff. If I had concerns, I was to report them immediately and let the medical staff handle it. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. He told me that 6 security guards had quit in the last 3 years. All of them had worked night shift. All of them had reported seeing things. He did not believe in ghosts, he said, but he believed that isolation and darkness could play tricks on the mind. He suggested I take a few days off, get some rest, and think about whether this job was right for me. I did not take the time off. I could not afford to. I had bills to pay, a family to support. So I kept working, kept making my rounds, kept trying to ignore the footsteps and the cold spots and the feeling that something was watching me every single night. The incident happened on July 19th. I was reviewing security tapes around 3 in the morning when I noticed something wrong with camera 7. The timestamp showed it was recording, but the image was frozen. Just a still shot of the empty hallway outside the morgue. I switched to camera 8, which covered the stairwell at the end of that hallway. Also frozen. Camera 9, frozen. Every camera on the second floor was showing the same still image, like time had stopped. Then, simultaneously, all the screens went to static. I sat there in my office, watching white noise fill every monitor, my heart pounding so hard I thought I would pass out. The static lasted maybe 30 seconds. Then the cameras came back online, and he was there, on every single screen, standing in different locations throughout the second floor, the hallway, the stairwell, the nurse's station, patient rooms, all showing the same figure in mining clothes, staring directly at the cameras with those dead black eyes. I grabbed my radio to call for help, but it was dead. No power. I picked up the desk phone. No dial tone. That was when I heard the footsteps in the hallway outside my office. Slow, dragging, getting closer. I have never been so terrified in my entire life. I wanted to run, but my legs would not work. I just sat there, shaking, watching the door, listening to those terrible footsteps getting closer and closer. They stopped right outside. The door handle began to turn. I do not remember screaming, but I must have, because suddenly there were nurses in the hallway and lights were on and people were asking if I was okay. The door was still closed, still locked. Nobody had tried to open it, but I know what I heard. I quit the next morning. No notice, no explanation. I just turned in my uniform and keys and walked out. My wife left me 2 months later, said I had changed, that I was paranoid and obsessed and she could not live like that anymore. She was right. I spent weeks researching the history of Whitehorse General Hospital, I found old newspapers, death records, property archives. The hospital was built on the site of an old mining camp from the 1890s. Dozens of miners died there during the gold rush, buried in shallow graves that were never properly marked. When they excavated for the hospital foundation in 1952, they found bones. Lots of bones. The construction company was ordered to rebury them in a nearby cemetery, but there are no records showing they actually did it. I think those bones are still there, under the hospital, under the morgue. I filed a formal complaint with the hospital board, demanded they investigate the security tapes, demanded they acknowledge what was happening. They refused, said I had no evidence, said the tapes had been recorded over during routine maintenance. But I know the truth. I know what I saw. And I know I am not the only one. Last month, I drove past Whitehorse General Hospital for the first time in 37 years. It is abandoned now, shut down in 2012 and left to rot. The windows are broken, the doors are chained, but I could still see that second-floor hallway, still see that green morgue door. And I swear, even in broad daylight, I could see frost on the glass. They say the security tapes from the 80s still exist, locked away where nobody can see them. They say if you watch them, really watch them, you can see him in the background of almost every frame. Standing in doorways, looking through windows, following the guards on their rounds. I believe it, because sometimes, even now, I wake up at 3 in the morning and feel the temperature drop in my bedroom. I smell that cold, frozen smell, and I hear footsteps in my hallway. Slow, dragging, getting closer. Story 5, Monster of Kluane Lake, Alaska Highway, this real Wendigo sighting. The thing I saw crossing the Alaska Highway was not a moose. I know what a moose looks like. I have driven this route for 17 years, hauling freight from Whitehorse to Fairbanks, and I have seen thousands of them. This was something else, something that moved wrong, something that should not exist. And the worst part is, I think it saw me too. I think it recognized me, and I am terrified it is still out there, waiting for me to come back. This happened 6 weeks ago, around 2 in the morning on a freezing November night. I was driving the loneliest stretch of highway in North America, the section that runs along Kluane Lake in the Yukon. If you have never driven it, you cannot understand how isolated it is. No gas stations, no rest stops, no lights except your headlights cutting through the darkness. Just endless forest on one side and the black, frozen expanse of the lake on the other. The kind of place where you can drive for an hour without seeing another vehicle. The kind of place where if something goes wrong, you are on your own. I had left Whitehorse just after midnight with a full load of construction equipment headed for Alaska. The roads were clear, the weather was cold but stable, and I was making good time. I had my thermos of coffee, my CB radio crackling with occasional chatter from other truckers somewhere far ahead, and my headlights blazing through the darkness. Everything was normal, routine, until I reached mile marker 312. That is when my headlights started flickering. At first, I thought it was just a loose connection, something that would fix itself. But the flickering got worse, pulsing in a rhythm that felt almost deliberate. My dashboard lights dimmed, and the radio cut out completely, replaced by a high-pitched whine that made my teeth ache. I tapped the radio, checked my gauges, and everything looked normal except for that horrible flickering. And then, just as suddenly as it started, everything went back to normal. Lights steady, radio silent, just the hum of my engine and the crunch of my tires on the pavement. But the air felt different, heavier, like the temperature had dropped 20 degrees in an instant. I could see my breath fogging inside the cab even though the heater was running full blast. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I got this creepy feeling, this instinctive animal awareness that something was watching me. I scanned the tree line on my right, looking for eyes reflecting in my headlights, but there was nothing. Just darkness pressing in from all sides. That was when I saw it standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on my brakes, my tires screaming against the asphalt, my load shifting behind me with a terrible grinding sound. My truck skidded sideways, jackknifing slightly before I got it under control, stopping maybe 30 feet from the thing. My heart was hammering so hard I thought I was having a heart attack. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, my hands shaking, staring at what my headlights had revealed. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. Moose, I thought, just a moose. But even as I thought it, I knew it was wrong. This thing was standing upright on 2 legs. It was easily 8 or 9 feet tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that looked too long for its body. Its skin, if you could call it that, was a grayish white, stretched so tight over its bones that I could see every rib, every joint, every ridge of its spine. Its arms hung down past its knees, ending in hands with fingers that looked more like claws. But it was the head that made me want to scream. It had antlers, massive, twisted antlers that sprouted from a skull that looked almost human but elongated, stretched, like someone had taken a human face and pulled it forward into a snout. Its eyes were deep black holes that seemed to absorb the light from my headlights rather than reflect it. And its mouth. God, its mouth was open, hanging slack, revealing rows of broken, yellowed teeth that looked like they had been filed to points. We stared at each other for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. I could not move. I could not breathe. Every muscle in my body was locked in pure, primal terror. This was not an animal. This was something wrong. Something that violated every natural law. And then it moved. It did not walk. It lurched, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. It took one step toward my truck, then another, its head tilting to the side in a gesture that was almost curious. I could hear it now, even through the cab of my truck. A sound like branches scraping against wood. A clicking, rattling noise that came from deep in its throat. And underneath that, something worse. A sound that might have been breathing, wet and labored, like lungs filled with fluid struggling to draw air. I do not know what made me move. Instinct, maybe. Survival. But I yanked the gearshift into reverse and floored it, my tires spinning on the pavement before catching. I looked in my side mirror and saw the thing lurch forward, faster now, closing the distance between us with horrifying speed. It was not running. It was moving in these long, impossible strides that covered 10 feet at a time. Its arms swinging loosely at its sides, its mouth opening wider, and I swear to God I heard it make a sound that might have been words. A long, drawn-out wail that sounded like hunger and rage and desperation all mixed together. I spun the wheel, got my truck facing forward again, and punched the accelerator. My engine roared, my load rattling behind me, and I shot forward down the highway, leaving that thing standing in my rearview mirror. But here's what still gives me nightmares. As I drove away, I watched it in my mirror. It did not chase me. It just stood there in the middle of the road, its head turning slowly to follow my taillights, and then it stepped sideways into the forest and vanished. Not running, not hiding, just stepping between the trees like it was walking through a door, disappearing into the darkness like it had never been there at all. I drove for 3 hours straight without stopping, pushing my truck as hard as I could, not caring about speed limits or rest breaks or anything except putting distance between myself and that stretch of highway. When I finally pulled into a truck stop just outside Tok, Alaska, I was shaking so badly I could barely turn off the engine. I sat there in the parking lot, surrounded by other trucks, their lights and the glow from the diner making me feel almost safe, and I tried to convince myself it had been a hallucination. Exhaustion. Maybe carbon monoxide from a leak in my exhaust. Anything except what I knew I had seen. I went inside and ordered coffee I did not drink. The waitress asked if I was okay, and I must have looked terrible because she brought me water and told me to sit as long as I needed. There were a few other truckers there, older guys who had been running this route longer than I had, and I debated whether to say anything. But the fear of sounding crazy, of losing my job, of being labeled as unreliable kept my mouth shut. So I just sat there, staring at my coffee, trying to stop my hands from shaking. That is when the old-timer in the booth behind me started talking. He was speaking to another driver, but his voice carried, and I heard every word. He was telling a story about the starvation winter of 1898, back during the Klondike Gold Rush. Thousands of prospectors had tried to reach the goldfields before winter set in, and hundreds of them got trapped along the trails near Kluane Lake when the snows came early. No food, no supplies, no way out. And when spring came, the survivors who stumbled into the camps told horrifying stories. They talked about people who had turned to cannibalism to survive, men who had eaten their companions and, according to the old native legends, had transformed into something else. Something cursed. The Wendigo, a creature of eternal hunger that could never be satisfied, condemned to wander the wilderness forever, searching for flesh. Most people dismissed it as folklore, just scary stories meant to discourage cannibalism. But the old-timer said that truckers had been reporting sightings along the Kluane stretch for decades. A tall, emaciated figure with antlers, something that crossed the road in the dead of night, something that watched from the tree line. He said most guys who saw it never drove that road again. I left the truck stop before dawn and finished my delivery in Fairbanks. I did not tell anyone what I had seen. I filed my logs, collected my pay, and drove back to Whitehorse on a different route, adding 6 hours to my trip just to avoid that section of highway. I told my dispatcher I needed a few weeks off, claimed family emergency, and holed up in my apartment trying to process what had happened. But the thing is, I cannot stop thinking about it. I have started researching the Wendigo legend, reading everything I can find. And the more I learn, the more terrified I become. Because according to the stories, the Wendigo does not just hunt randomly. It marks its prey, it follows them, and it always comes back. 3 nights ago, I woke up at 2 a.m. to a sound outside my apartment. A clicking, rattling noise that I recognized instantly. I looked out my window, and in the parking lot below, standing under a street light, I saw something tall and thin. Too far away to see clearly, but the silhouette was unmistakable. Antlers, long arms, and it was facing my building. I did not go outside. I locked every door and window and sat in my living room with the lights on until sunrise. When I finally looked out again, it was gone, but there were marks in the frost on the pavement. Long, dragging footprints that led from the tree line behind the complex right up to the door of my building. And then they just stopped. I do not know what to do. I cannot run forever. I cannot keep avoiding that highway. It is my job. It is how I make a living. But every time I think about going back, I remember those black eyes staring at me through my windshield. I remember that sound, that clicking, rattling hunger. And I know, deep in my bones, that it is waiting for me. That next time I drive past mile marker 312, it will be there again. And this time, I do not think it will just watch. Last night, I found something that made everything worse. I was going through old CB radio logs, recordings from other truckers on that route, and I found a transmission from 1994. A driver reporting a creature on the road near Kluane Lake. He described it exactly the way I had seen it. Tall, emaciated, antlers, moving wrong. His voice was panicked, terrified. The transmission cut off mid-sentence with a sound that might have been screaming. They found his truck 3 days later, abandoned on the side of the highway, engine still running, driver door wide open. The load was untouched, his coffee was still warm. But he was gone. No blood, no signs of struggle, just gone. They never found him. I keep telling myself I'm going to quit. Find a different job, move somewhere far from the wilderness, far from the lonely highways and the endless forests. But deep down, I know it does not matter, because I have seen it now. I have looked into those black, hungry eyes, and I think that when you see the Wendigo, when it marks you, distance does not matter. It will find you. It will always find you. 2 hours ago, my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost did not answer, but something made me pick up. There was nothing on the other end. Just breathing. Wet, labored breathing. And underneath it, faint and distant. That clicking, rattling sound. I am writing this down because I need someone to know. If something happens to me, if I disappear, this is why. This is what I saw on the Alaska Highway near Kluane Lake. This is the truth. And tonight, I have to drive that route again. My dispatcher called. Emergency load. No one else available. Mile marker 312. I do not think I am coming back. Story 6. Ghosts of the SS Klondike. The saloon girl who still sings. I smelled her perfume before I saw anything else. And that is when I knew something terrifying was about to happen. It was 3 a.m. on the deck of the SS Klondike. The old sternwheeler docked permanently in Whitehorse. And I was alone with recording equipment that had just picked up a woman singing in an empty room. The scent hit me like a wave, thick and sweet and completely out of place in the freezing Yukon night. Roses and something else, something older, like the perfume had been sitting in a closed drawer for 100 years. My hands were shaking as I checked my audio recorder. The singing was still there, captured in the digital file, a slow, haunting melody in a voice that sounded both beautiful and deeply wrong. I was a paranormal investigator, had been for 15 years, and I had never encountered anything like this. The SS Klondike was supposed to be one of the most haunted locations in Canada. Local stories talked about residual hauntings, shadow figures, the usual claims you hear about historic sites. But the reports that brought me here were different. They were about Mary, a saloon girl who had worked the steamboat circuit during the Klondike Gold Rush, who had died of a broken heart according to legend, and who supposedly still walked the decks of this preserved ship, singing the songs she used to perform for miners and gamblers over a century ago. I had arrived in Whitehorse 2 days earlier, in late September when the nights were getting long and cold. The SS Klondike sat on the bank of the Yukon River, a massive paddle wheeler that had been restored and turned into a historic site. During the day, tourists walked through the cabins and engine room, learning about the gold rush era and the dangerous river journeys these boats used to make. At night, the ship belonged to something else. The curator who gave me access, a woman named Ellen, had been reluctant to let me stay overnight. She told me about the experiences staff members had reported over the years. Footsteps in empty corridors, doors that opened and closed by themselves, the overwhelming smell of roses appearing suddenly in the old saloon area where passengers used to drink and gamble. And the singing, always the singing, coming from nowhere. A woman, this voice performing old songs from the 1890s. Sometimes sad, sometimes angry, always unsettling. Ellen said 3 different psychics had identified the presence as Mary, a young woman who had fallen in love with a riverboat captain who abandoned her. The heartbreak killed her, or so the story went, and her spirit never left the boat she had called home. My first night on the ship had been quiet. I set up cameras in the main saloon, the passenger cabins, and the crew quarters. I positioned my audio recorders in spots where previous investigators had captured electronic voice phenomena. I waited. Nothing happened. Just the creaking of old wood and the sound of the river flowing past outside. I almost convinced myself the stories were exaggerated, the usual small-town folklore that builds up around any old building. Then came the second night, and everything changed. I was doing an EVP session in the main saloon around midnight, asking questions into the darkness, waiting for responses that might show up on the audio when I played it back. The saloon was a long room with a restored bar at one end, tables and chairs arranged like they would have been during the gold rush, old photographs on the walls showing the ship in its working days. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath, even though the heating system was running. I asked my standard questions. Is anyone here with us? Can you tell me your name? What happened to you? The silence that followed felt heavy, expectant, like the room was holding its breath. Then I heard it, singing, faint at first, coming from somewhere deeper in the ship, maybe from the lower deck or the cargo hold. A woman's voice, the melody old-fashioned and mournful. I grabbed my recorder and followed the sound, my flashlight cutting through the darkness of the narrow corridors. The singing got louder as I descended the stairs toward the crew quarters. The song was one I did not recognize, something about a river and a lover who would never return. The voice was beautiful in a chilling way, perfectly on pitch but emotionless, like whoever was singing had performed this song so many times it had become mechanical. I reached the crew quarters and the singing stopped, just cut off mid-note, leaving only the sound of my own ragged breathing and the creak of the ship settling. I called out, asked if anyone was there. No response. I checked my audio recorder and felt my stomach drop. The singing was there in the recording, clear as anything, but underneath it was something else. Whispered words I had not heard in real time. Dozens of overlapping voices all saying the same thing. She is awake. She is awake. She is awake. I should have left right then. Every instinct I had was screaming that this was different from other investigations, that something genuinely dangerous was happening on this ship. But I was thinking about the evidence, about how clear that audio was, about how this could be the most significant paranormal documentation I had ever captured. I went back to the main saloon and set up for another EVP session. That is when the perfume smell hit me for the first time. It appeared suddenly, so strong it made my eyes water. Roses in decay, sweet and rotten at the same time. The temperature in the room dropped so fast that frost started forming on the windows. My breath came out in thick white clouds. The lights I had set up started flickering, even though they were running on battery power. Then I heard footsteps, not heavy boots or the sound of someone trying to sneak around. These were light, deliberate. The footsteps of a woman in heels walking across a wooden floor. They came from the back of the saloon, near the bar, moving slowly toward where I was standing. I turned my flashlight toward the sound and saw her. Not clearly, not like a living person, but enough to make every hair on my body stand up. A figure standing near the bar, translucent and flickering like old film footage. She wore a long dress from another era, her hair piled up on her head in an old-fashioned style. Her face was pale, too pale, and her eyes were dark holes that seemed to pull at the light. She was staring directly at me. The singing started again, But this time it was coming from her, from that impossible figure standing in my flashlight beam. The same mournful melody, but now I could feel the emotion behind it. Rage and sorrow and loneliness so profound it felt like drowning. I tried to speak, tried to ask who she was, but my voice would not work. The figure started moving toward me, not walking but gliding, her feet not quite touching the floor. The perfume smell became overwhelming, suffocating. I stumbled backward and my hand hit one of the tables. The moment I broke eye contact with the figure, she vanished. Just blinked out of existence like she had never been there. My equipment had captured everything. The figure showed up clearly on my infrared camera, a cold spot in human shape moving across the room. The audio had recorded the singing and something else, a voice speaking in the gaps between the notes. When I played it back, my blood went cold. The voice was saying my name, over and over, in that same emotionless tone, calling me by a name only my family and close friends used, a nickname this ghost should not have known. I checked the timestamp on the footage, 3:17 in the morning. The same time, I later learned that Mary had died over 100 years ago, alone in a cabin on a steamboat very similar to this one, her heart literally broken by grief according to the doctor who examined her body. The connection between the past and present felt thin suddenly, like I was standing in both time periods at once, like the ship existed in some loop where the same tragedy played out forever. I tried to pack up my gear, tried to get out of there, but the ship had other plans. The door to the main saloon would not open. It was not locked or stuck. It simply would not move, like it had become part of the wall. I tried the windows. They would not budge. I was trapped in that freezing room with the smell of roses and the lingering sense that I was not alone, that something was watching me from the shadows at the edge of my flashlight beam. I heard footsteps again, this time coming from multiple directions. Voices too. Whispered conversations in the walls. The sounds of a busy saloon from a century ago bleeding through into the present. Laughter and shouting and the clink of glasses. Piano music playing somewhere, the same sad melody the ghost had been singing. The room around me started to change. The restored furniture looked older, more worn. The photographs on the wall seemed to move, figures shifting position when I was not looking directly at them. Then she appeared again, closer this time, standing just a few feet away. Mary. I knew it was her with a certainty I cannot explain. She was more solid now, more present, and I could see details I had missed before. The dress she wore was stained, dark spots that looked like old blood or wine. Her hands were clenched at her sides. Her mouth was moving, but the sounds were wrong, delayed, like watching a badly dubbed film. She was trying to tell me something, trying to communicate, but whatever separated the living from the dead was distorting the message. I forced myself to stay calm, to treat this like any other investigation. I asked her what she wanted, why she was still here. The temperature dropped even further. Ice was forming on the bar now, spreading across the wood in crystalline patterns. Mary's ghost pointed toward the back corner of the saloon, toward a section of wall covered in old photographs and artifacts. Then she opened her mouth and screamed. The sound was not human. It was rage and pain given voice, so loud and piercing that I dropped to my knees with my hands over my ears. Every piece of glass in the room shattered. My equipment sparked and died. The lights went out completely, leaving me in total darkness except for the faint glow of moonlight through the frosted windows. In that moment of blackness, I felt hands on me. Cold, impossibly strong hands grabbing my shoulders, my arms, pushing me toward the corner Mary had pointed to. I tried to fight, tried to pull away, but the force was overwhelming. I was shoved hard against the wall, my face pressed against the old wood paneling. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The hands released me. The temperature began to rise. I could hear the normal sounds of the ship again, the subtle creaks and groans of an old vessel at rest. I fumbled for my backup flashlight, and when the beam came on, I was alone. Mary was gone, but something had changed. The wall panel I had been pushed against was loose. I pulled at it and it came away easily, revealing a hidden space behind the original wall of the ship. Inside was a small bundle wrapped in rotting cloth. My hands were shaking as I carefully opened it. Inside were personal items. A hairbrush with long dark hair still tangled in the bristles. A locket containing a photograph of a young woman and a stern-looking man in a captain's uniform. Letters. Dozens of them, tied with a ribbon that had once been red but had faded to brown. The return address on the letters showed they had been sent to Mary but never delivered, intercepted and hidden away by someone on the ship. I read the first few by flashlight. They were from the captain, the man she had loved, explaining that he could not marry her because he already had a wife in San Francisco, that she needed to stop following the steamboat routes, that what they had was over. The letters got progressively crueler, more dismissive. The last one, dated just days before Mary's death, told her she was pathetic and that he would have her removed from the boat circuit if she did not leave him alone. She had never seen these letters. She had died believing he loved her, believing he would come back for her, not knowing he had been writing to her the whole time but having the correspondence intercepted by someone, probably one of his crew trying to protect the captain's reputation. Mary had died of a broken heart, but it was based on a lie. She had been grieving over abandonment that included an explanation she never received, an explanation that would have been cold comfort but was still hidden from her. The tragedy was deeper and more cruel than the legend suggested. I sat there on the floor of the saloon, surrounded by broken glass and dead equipment, holding these letters that had been hidden for over a century, and I understood why Mary was still here. She was waiting for answers that had been in the walls the whole time, trapped in the same loop of grief and confusion that had killed her. The door to the saloon opened easily now. I gathered what remained of my equipment and the bundle of Mary's possessions and left the ship as the first light of dawn was touching the Yukon River. Ellen found me sitting on the dock, exhausted and probably in shock. I told her everything, showed her the letters, the hidden compartment, the footage I had managed to recover from my backup camera. Her face went pale as she read through the correspondence. She told me that historical records had always been unclear about Mary's death, that some accounts said she had killed herself while others claimed she died of natural causes brought on by depression. No one had known about the letters. No one had thought to look behind the walls of the restored ship for artifacts that might have been deliberately hidden. Ellen contacted historians in the local museum. The letters were authenticated. Mary's story was rewritten in the official records of the SS Klondike. The truth finally documented after more than 100 years. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought finding the letters and revealing the truth would give Mary some kind of peace, would let her move on from whatever kept her tied to that ship. I was wrong. The activity on the SS Klondike has only increased since that night. More visitors report the singing, the perfume, the feeling of being pushed by unseen hands. The difference now is that the encounters are more aggressive, more desperate. Mary is not just repeating the same residual haunting anymore. She is trying to tell her story, trying to make people understand what was done to her. 3 separate paranormal teams have investigated the ship since I was there, and all of them captured the same thing I did. A woman, this voice singing sad songs from the Gold Rush era, and underneath the melody, whispered words that sound like accusations and warnings. The curator told me they found more hidden spaces in the walls, more artifacts that had been deliberately concealed. Personal belongings from other women who had worked the steamboat circuit, suggesting Mary was not the only one whose life had been destroyed and then erased. I have not been back to the SS Klondike. I still have nightmares about that night, about the feeling of those cold hands on me, about the rage in Mary's eyes when she screamed. But the worst part, the thing that keeps me awake, is knowing she is still there. Still singing, still waiting for someone who is never coming back, still trapped in a moment of heartbreak that will never end. The letters I found were supposed to give her closure, but maybe some wounds are too deep for closure. Maybe some betrayals echo forever. I listen to the audio I captured sometimes, late at night when I cannot sleep, and I hear her voice calling my name between the notes of her song, and I wonder if finding those letters was what she wanted or if I just gave her proof that her suffering was even more pointless than she imagined. The horror is not that she haunts the ship. The horror is that she has every reason to, and there is nothing anyone can do to change it. I destroyed a woman's last hope while trying to help her, and now her ghost knows the full extent of what was taken from her. She is more awake now than ever before, more aware, more angry, and she is never going to stop singing those sad songs on the deck of the SS Klondike. If you ever visit Whitehorse, if you ever tour that old sternwheeler docked by the river, and you smell roses where no roses grow, do not follow the scent. Do not listen if you hear singing. Mary is still looking for answers that will never satisfy her, still reaching out for the living, and I think she is trying to pull others into her grief so she does not have to be alone in it anymore. I gave her the truth, and the truth made everything so much worse. Story 7. Car cross. Bushman. Murders. Yukon. Is Bigfoot gone wrong? The blood was still frozen to the cabin walls when I arrived, and those footprints in the snow were so massive, so impossibly deep, that I knew immediately this wasn't going to be in any police report I could write with a straight face. My name is Robert Mackenzie, and in February of 1974, I was a Royal Canadian Mounted Police Constable stationed in Whitehorse, Yukon Territory. I had been with the force for 8 years, mostly dealing with domestic disputes, drunk drivers, and the occasional poacher. Nothing in my training prepared me for what I found at that trapper, as camped 30 miles outside Carcross, deep in the bush where the forests are so thick that daylight barely penetrates the canopy even at noon. The call came in from a bush pilot named Henderson who had been doing a supply drop to a remote mining operation. He had flown over the camp and noticed something wrong, something that made him circle back twice before radiating into our office. He said the camp looked destroyed, that he could see dark stains in the snow from 500 feet up, and that no smoke was coming from the chimney despite the temperature being 30 below zero. I flew out with Henderson the next morning, along with another constable named Davies who had more backcountry experience than me. The flight took 40 minutes, following the frozen Yukon River north before banking east into increasingly remote wilderness. Henderson kept glancing back at us from the cockpit, his jaw tight, not saying much. When we finally descended toward the camp, I understood why. From the air, it looked like a bomb had gone off. 2 cabins that should have been intact were partially collapsed, their walls splintered outward as if something had smashed through them from the inside. Equipment was scattered across the clearing, barrels overturned, a sled broken into pieces. And everywhere, staining the pristine white snow, were dark patches that could only be blood. We landed on a frozen lake about a quarter mile from the camp and snowshoed in, carrying rifles and emergency gear. The temperature was brutal, that kind of cold that burns your lungs with every breath and makes your eyes water instantly. The forest around us was absolutely silent. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of our boots in the snow and the hammering of my own heartbeat in my ears. The smell hit us before we reached the clearing. Even in that freezing air, there was a stench of decay and something else, something wild and musky, like wet fur and rotting meat mixed together. Davies stopped walking and raised his rifle, scanning the tree line. He had gone pale, and I noticed his hands were shaking. The first body was just inside the clearing, half buried in snow that had been stained red and then frozen solid. It was Thomas Garrett, one of the 2 trappers who worked this territory. I had met him once in Whitehorse, a tough old man in his 60s who had spent 40 years in the bush and knew these forests better than anyone. What was left of him was barely recognizable as human. His body had been torn apart with a violence that seemed impossible. One arm was missing entirely, ripped from the socket with such force that bone fragments were scattered 10 feet away. His chest cavity was crushed inward, ribs shattered and protruding through his heavy winter coat. But what made my stomach turn was his face, frozen in an expression of pure terror, eyes wide open and staring at something I could not see, mouth locked in a silent scream. Davies radioed back to the plane, his voice cracking, requesting backup and a coroner. Henderson responded that he was not leaving the lake, that he would wait for us, but he was not coming any closer to that camp. I did not blame him. We found the second body inside the larger cabin. James Whitmore had been Garrett's partner, a younger man in his 30s who had moved to the Yukon from Ontario 5 years earlier. He had made it inside before whatever attacked them caught up to him. The door had been smashed inward. Heavy logs splintered like kindling, and Whitmore's body was slumped against the far wall in a pool of frozen blood. The wounds were similar to Garrett's, massive trauma indicating incredible strength. His skull had been partially caved in, and deep lacerations covered his arms and torso, tears in the flesh that looked like claw marks but far larger than any bear I had ever seen. The cabin interior was destroyed, furniture overturned, supplies scattered, the small wood stove knocked over and cold. But it was the footprints that changed everything. They were everywhere in the snow around the camp, pressed deep into the frozen ground with a weight that suggested something massive. I knelt beside the clearest print and measured it with my handspan. 18 inches long, maybe 7 inches wide at the ball, with 5 distinct toe impressions. The stride length between prints was over 6 feet, far longer than any human could manage. These were not bear tracks. Bears have shorter, wider prints with claw marks extending well beyond the toe pads. These prints looked almost human, with an arch and a heel strike pattern, but scaled up to an impossible size. And there were dozens of them, circling the camp, approaching from the forest, converging on both cabins. Davies and I followed the tracks into the tree line, moving slowly with our rifles raised. The prints led away from the camp in a straight line, crashing through underbrush that should have been impassable, snapping branches as thick as my wrist like they were twigs. Whatever made these tracks had not tried to avoid obstacles or move quietly. It had simply powered through the forest with terrifying strength and speed. We followed for maybe 200 yards before Davies grabbed my arm and pointed. Ahead, hanging from a spruce tree about 8 feet off the ground, was something that made my blood run cold. It was Garrett, his missing arm, placed deliberately in the fork of 2 branches, positioned almost like a warning or a marker. The flesh had been stripped away in places, teeth marks visible in the exposed bone. That was when we heard it, a sound from somewhere deeper in the forest, low and guttural. Not quite an animal growl, but not human either. It resonated through the trees with a bass tone that I felt in my chest, a sound full of menace and rage. Davies and I looked at each other, and without speaking we turned and ran back toward the camp, abandoning any pretense of professional investigation. We made it back to the lake in record time and practically threw ourselves into Henderson, his plane. He had the engine running before we even secured the door, lifting off the ice with a desperation that matched our own. As we climbed and banked back toward Whitehorse, I looked down at the camp one last time. Standing at the edge of the clearing, barely visible against the dark trees, was a shape that should not exist. It was massive, perhaps 9 or 10 feet tall, covered in dark fur, standing upright on 2 legs. It was watching the plane, completely still, and even from that altitude I could feel its eyes on us, tracking our movement with an intelligence that was utterly terrifying. Then it turned and walked back into the forest, moving with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large, and disappeared into the shadows. The official report listed the deaths as a bear attack, despite the obvious problems with that explanation. My supervisor, a staff sergeant who had never set foot in the real bush, refused to even look at the photographs of the footprints. He told me to file the paperwork and forget about it, that wild animal attacks happened and there was no point in creating a panic over some trappers who took unnecessary risks. But I could not forget. I started asking questions, talking to old-timers in the bars around Whitehorse, people who had spent their entire lives in the Yukon wilderness. Most of them refused to discuss it, changing the subject or walking away when I brought up the Carcross area. But a few, after enough drinks and in quiet corners where nobody else could hear, told me stories. They called it the Bushmen, a name passed down from indigenous peoples who had lived in these territories for thousands of years. It was not like the Pacific Northwest Sasquatch that tourists and researchers talked about. The Bushman was violent, territorial, and aggressive. It did not avoid humans or hide from confrontation. It defended its territory with savage brutality, and it had killed before. One old trapper named McGillis told me about an incident in the 1920s, before the Alaska Highway was built, when 3 prospectors disappeared near the same area. Their camp was found destroyed, bodies never recovered, only massive footprints in the mud and blood staining the rocks. Another incident in 1958, a hunting party that came back with stories of being stalked by something huge in the forest, something that walked on 2 legs and screamed in the night. One of those hunters shot at it and swore he hit its center mass, but it did not go down, just roared and charged before they all ran for their lives. McGillis leaned close to me, his breath reeking of whiskey, and told me the most disturbing part. The Bushmen took trophies. Bodies were found mutilated, parts missing, arranged in ways that suggested intelligence and purpose. It was not just killing to eat or killing in defense. It was killing with intent, with rage, sending a message to stay out of its territory. I went back to the camp 3 weeks later with a larger team and better equipment. The bodies had been recovered, the site had been photographed and documented, but I needed to see it again in daylight, needed to understand what had happened. We found more evidence that had been missed in the initial investigation. Clumps of dark fur caught on tree bark, 8 feet off the ground. Deep gouges in the cabin logs that matched the spacing of the claw marks on the bodies. And more footprints, a trail that led deeper into the wilderness than we had followed before. We tracked them for miles, following a route that took us into increasingly remote terrain, far from any trail or landmark. The prints led to a rocky outcropping near a frozen stream, and there, in a shallow cave formed by overhanging boulders, we found what might have been a den or shelter. The ground was trampled flat, bones scattered around the entrance, and the smell was overwhelming. That same musky stench from the camp, but concentrated and thick. Among the bones I found a human jawbone, weathered and old, and a torn piece of fabric that looked like it came from a plaid wool shirt the kind trappers wore. These were not the only victims. This thing had been killing for years, maybe decades, and nobody had done anything about it because nobody wanted to believe what was really out there in those forests. We left the cave and never went back. The area was quietly closed to trapping and hunting, marked on maps as restricted territory with vague explanations about wildlife conservation. No official announcement, no public warning, just a quiet understanding among locals that some parts of the bush were off limits. I left the RCMP in 1976 and moved south to British Columbia. I told people it was for family reasons, for better opportunities, normal explanations that did not invite questions. But the truth is I could not stay in the Yukon knowing what I knew, seeing those forests every day and wondering what else was out there, watching from the shadows. I still have the photographs from that investigation, hidden in a box in my basement. 18-inch footprints in the snow, clear as day. The destroyed cabin, the blood, the evidence of violence that no bear could have caused. And one photograph, slightly blurred but unmistakable, taken from the plane as we flew away. The dark shape standing at the edge of the clearing, tall and massive and utterly impossible, watching us leave its territory. The official files on the Garrett and Whitmore deaths are sealed, classified for reasons that were never explained to me. Every few years I see a news story about a missing hiker or a hunter who never came back from the Yukon bush. And I wonder if the bushman is still there, still defending its territory with the same savage efficiency. Sometimes late at night I think about that sound we heard in the forest, that low guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through my entire body. It was not the sound of an animal acting on instinct. It was the sound of something intelligent, something that understood what it was doing, that chose violence deliberately. And I think about those footprints leading away into the darkness, deeper into wilderness that no map can capture, into forests so remote that nobody knows what lives there or what rules govern survival in that frozen hell. The bushman is still out there. I know it is, and somewhere in the Yukon, in the deep bush where humans rarely go, it is waiting for the next person foolish enough to enter its territory, ready to defend what it considers its own with a brutality that defies explanation. The horror is not that it exists. The horror is that we pretend it does not. Story 8, Cursed Gold of Lost Creek. 5 prospectors. One mystery: I found the map in my grandfather. His things 3 weeks after his funeral. And that discovery set in motion the most terrifying experience of my life. The paper was old, yellowed, fragile as skin, tucked inside a leather journal I had never seen before. My grandfather had been a quiet man, kept to himself mostly, never talked much about his past. But this journal, filled with his shaky handwriting, told a story that made my blood run cold. It was about Lost Creek, about 5 men who went looking for gold in 1931, and about something dark and ancient waiting in those hills. Only one of those men came back alive, and he spent the rest of his days in an asylum, screaming about the old ones. My name is David Keller, and I am 42 years old. I work construction in Fairbanks, Alaska. I am a practical man, not given to superstition or ghost stories. But what happened to me last month in those remote northern mountains changed everything I thought I knew about the world. This is my true story, and I swear every word of it is real. The journal entries started in June of 1931. 5 partners, all experienced prospectors, had heard rumors about a creek deep in the wilderness where gold nuggets could be picked up right off the streambed. They called it Lost Creek because nobody could find it twice. The few who claimed to have seen it could never locate it again, like the land itself shifted and hid the place from human eyes. But these 5 men were determined. They had a map, rough and hand-drawn, supposedly copied from a native guide who refused to go with them. The guide had warned them, my grandfather wrote, that the creek was protected by something old, something that lived in the hills before humans ever walked that land. The men ignored the warning. They set out in early July with enough supplies for 3 months. Their names were written clearly in the journal: Thomas Weaver, John Pike, Samuel Cross, Robert Henley, and my great-uncle, Martin Keller. Only Martin came back. He returned in late September, alone, covered in dirt and blood, his eyes wild and broken. He had no gold, no equipment, no memory of how he got back to civilization. He just kept repeating the same phrase over and over. The old ones in the hills. The old ones in the hills. They are still hungry. They locked him away. He died in that asylum 6 years later, never speaking another coherent word. My grandfather spent decades trying to find out what happened to those men. He interviewed Martin before he died, but got nothing useful. He searched records, talked to old-timers, hiked into those mountains himself looking for Lost Creek. He never found it, but he never stopped believing the story was real. The last entry in his journal was dated 2 months before his death. He wrote that he finally understood why the creek could not be found. It did not want to be found, and anyone who went looking for it was making a terrible mistake. I should have listened to that warning, but I was grieving, unemployed after a bad injury at work, and desperate for something, anything, to change my situation. The idea of lost gold, of striking it rich and solving all my problems, was too tempting to ignore. I studied that map for days, cross-referenced it with modern topographical surveys, and figured out approximately where Lost Creek should be. I convinced myself it was just a camping trip, a way to honor my grandfather, this memory. Nothing dangerous, nothing scary. I was so wrong. I drove up into the mountains in early September, following old mining roads until they disappeared into nothing but wilderness. The landscape was harsh and beautiful, all jagged peaks and dark forests of spruce and pine. The air smelled like earth and rain. I saw a few hikers in the first 2 days, but as I went deeper, the trails emptied out. By the third day, I had not seen another human being. That was when I started noticing the silence. It was not normal forest silence, with birds calling and wind rustling through the trees. This was complete, suffocating quiet. No animals, no insects, just the sound of my own breathing and my boots crunching on the rocky trail. Even the wind seemed muted, like the land was holding its breath. I found the creek on the 4th day. It was hidden in a narrow valley between 2 steep hillsides, exactly where the map said it would be. The water was crystal clear, running fast over smooth stones, and when the sunlight hit it just right, I could see flashes of yellow in the stream bed. Gold. My heart was pounding as I dropped my pack and waded into the water. The cold bit through my boots immediately, but I did not care. I reached down and picked up a stone, turned it over in my hand, and there it was. A nugget the size of my thumbnail, pure and heavy and real. I had found Lost Creek. I should have felt excited, triumphant, but standing there in that freezing water, holding that gold in my hand, all I felt was dread. Deep, bone-chilling dread that made my stomach turn and my skin crawl. The hills around me felt wrong. They were too steep, too close, pressing in like they were watching. And carved into the rock face on the far side of the creek, barely visible under moss and erosion, were symbols. Ancient symbols, spirals and lines and shapes that hurt to look at. I took pictures with my phone, even though I had no signal out here. Then I started collecting gold, filling my pockets, my pack, working fast because I wanted to get out of that valley as quickly as possible. The silence was getting worse, heavier, and the temperature was dropping even though it was early afternoon. That was when I found the first body. It was wedged between 2 boulders about 50 yards upstream, mostly skeleton now, but with scraps of clothing still clinging to the bones. Old clothing, canvas and wool, rotted boots, and next to the skeleton, half buried in the mud, was a rusted pickaxe with initials carved into the handle, T.W. Thomas Weaver. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. These were the men from 1931. They had died here, all of them except Martin. And he had seen something so horrifying that it shattered his mind completely. I should have run then, should have dropped everything and gotten out of that valley immediately. But I was frozen, staring at those bones, trying to understand what could have killed 5 experienced men in a place like this. Then I heard the sound. It came from up in the hills, a low humming that vibrated through the ground and into my bones. Not mechanical, not animal, something else, something that sounded almost like singing, but in no language I had ever heard. The symbols on the rock face started to glow. I am not exaggerating. I am not insane. The carvings lit up with a pale green light that pulsed in rhythm with that terrible humming sound. And the temperature dropped so fast that frost formed on the rocks around me. I ran. I grabbed my pack and ran downstream, splashing through the water, slipping on stones, not caring about the gold anymore. The humming grew louder behind me, and I could hear something moving in the hills. Not footsteps, more like the earth itself was shifting, grinding, coming alive. I made it maybe a quarter mile before I saw them. Figures standing on the hillsides. Tall, impossibly tall, with bodies that seemed wrong, like they were not quite solid. They were made of shadow and stone and something organic that moved like muscle under skin. Their faces were blank except for eyes that glowed the same pale green as the symbols. The old ones, they did not chase me. They just watched as I ran, standing perfectly still on the slopes above. And I understood then what had happened to those 5 men in 1931. They had taken the gold. They had disturbed something that should have been left alone. And the land itself had punished them for it. Martin must have seen these things, must have watched his partners die, and the horror of it had broken his mind so completely that he could never recover. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. I collapsed on the trail miles from that valley, shaking so hard I thought I would pass out. When I finally looked back, the figures were gone. The humming had stopped, but I could still feel them watching. It took me 2 days to get back to my truck. I drove straight home without stopping, threw away everything I had brought with me, and tried to forget what I had seen. But I cannot forget. The gold I collected is still in my pack. I have not touched it. I am too afraid to, because every night since I got back, I hear that humming sound in my dreams. And when I wake up, there are symbols drawn in the frost on my windows. The same symbols I saw carved into the rock at Lost Creek. I looked up the history of freak accidents in those mountains. My grandfather was right. Dozens of prospectors and hikers have disappeared or died under strange circumstances over the last 100 years. All of them in the same general area where Lost Creek supposedly exists. The land is protecting itself, or something in the land is protecting itself. Something ancient that does not want to be disturbed. Last week, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single page torn from an old journal, the handwriting shaky and desperate. It was from Martin Keller, my great-uncle, written in the asylum just before he died. It said, "They followed me home. They are patient. They are hungry. They will never stop watching." I burned that letter immediately, but it was too late, because now I see them too, standing at the edge of my property at night. Tall shadow figures with glowing green eyes. Never moving closer, just watching, waiting. I am writing this down as a warning. Do not look for Lost Creek. Do not believe the stories about easy gold. The 5 men who went there in 1931 paid with their lives, and Martin paid with his sanity. I do not know what I will pay yet, but I can feel them getting closer every night, and I know it is only a matter of time before they decide to collect what I owe them. The humming has started again. I can hear it right now, coming from outside my house. And the symbols are glowing on my walls. Story 9. Phantom Piper of the Miles Canyon, a Civil War ghost in Canada. The sound of bagpipes should not exist in the middle of nowhere. I know that now. When you hear music where there should be only silence, when those haunting notes drift through the darkness near a place where men have died, you need to understand something terrifying is happening. You need to run. But I did not run. I followed the sound. And what I discovered at Miles Canyon changed everything I thought I knew about death and the thin line between our world and whatever waits beyond. This happened last September during what was supposed to be a simple photography trip. I am a freelance photographer based out of Seattle, and I had driven up to the Yukon to capture the fall colors before winter set in. Miles Canyon sits just outside Whitehorse, a deep gorge carved by the Yukon River with walls of volcanic rock rising over 100 feet on either side. The water below churns and boils, white rapids that have claimed dozens of lives over the past century. It is beautiful in a raw, dangerous way, the kind of place that demands respect. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already sinking toward the horizon, painting the canyon walls in shades of orange and red. The trail along the rim was well maintained but empty. Tourist season was over, and I had the place completely to myself. The air was cold and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the distant roar of the rapids far below. Perfect conditions for the eerie, isolated shots I wanted. I set up my tripod near the edge, checking my exposure, completely focused on getting the right light. That is when I heard it for the first time. Faint, distant, the unmistakable sound of bagpipes playing somewhere in the forest behind me. At first, I thought it was coming from the parking area, maybe someone sitting in their car playing music. But as I listened, I realized the sound was not coming from any speakers. It was live. Someone was actually playing bagpipes out here in the wilderness, and the melody was old, mournful, the kind of tune you might hear at a funeral or a memorial service. I turned away from the canyon edge and scanned the tree line. The music seemed to be coming from deeper in the forest, off the main trail. My first instinct was curiosity. Who would be out here playing bagpipes at sunset? I checked my watch. Almost 6 o'clock. Light was fading fast, but the photographer in me could not resist. This could be an incredible shot. A lone piper silhouetted against the darkening forest. So I grabbed my camera, left my tripod by the trail, and headed toward the sound. The moment I stepped off the marked path, something changed. The temperature dropped noticeably, my breath misting in front of my face. The sound of the rapids faded, replaced by an oppressive silence broken only by the distant pipes. The melody was clearer now, and I recognized it as a Scottish lament. Slow and sad, each note hanging in the air like a cry of grief. But there was something wrong about it. The sound wavered, distorted, as if the player was struggling for breath or the instrument itself was damaged. I pushed through the underbrush, dead branches snapping under my boots, my eyes scanning for any sign of movement. The forest here was dense, the trees growing close together, their branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out most of the remaining daylight. Shadows stretched between the trunks, deep and impenetrable. And still the pipes played, always just ahead, always just out of sight. That is when I noticed the path. Not a modern hiking trail, but something older, a narrow track worn into the earth by countless footsteps over many years. It led deeper into the forest, winding between the trees, heading parallel to the canyon rim. The music was coming from somewhere along this path. I followed it, my camera hanging from my neck, my footsteps crunching on the carpet of dead pine needles. After about 10 minutes, the path opened into a small clearing. And that is where I found the first grave marker. It was old, a simple wooden cross weathered gray by decades of exposure, tilted at an angle in the hard ground. The name carved into the crosspiece was barely legible, worn away by time and weather. But I could make out enough to read it. Malcolm Fraser, died October 1898. And underneath, a single word, Piper. The bagpipes stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating. I stood there in the clearing, staring at that grave marker, and felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The air was freezing now, so cold it hurt to breathe. And I realized with a creeping sense of dread that I was not alone anymore. Something was watching me from the trees. I turned slowly, scanning the shadows, and saw movement at the edge of the clearing. A figure standing between two large spruce trees, partially hidden in the darkness. It was the shape of a man, but wrong somehow. Too still, too rigid. I raised my camera instinctively, my photographer brain taking over, and looked through the viewfinder. What I saw through the lens made my blood turn to ice. The figure was wearing old clothes. Not modern hiking gear, but period clothing from over a century ago. Dark wool trousers, a heavy coat, and a tam o' shanter cap. He was holding bagpipes, the instrument clutched against his chest. But it was his face that froze me in place. He had no eyes, just dark, empty sockets that seemed to absorb the light. His skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over his skull. And his mouth was open in a silent scream. I lowered my camera, my hands shaking, and the figure was gone. Just gone, like he had never been there. But the cold remained, and I could smell something now. Earth, rot, the smell of a grave opened after many years. I backed away from the clearing, my heart hammering, my breath coming in short gasps. I needed to get back to the trail. I needed to get out of these woods. But as I turned to leave, the pipes started again, closer this time, much closer, right behind me. I spun around and saw him standing not 10 feet away, the phantom piper, his empty eye sockets fixed on me, his fingers moving over the chanter of his pipes, producing that terrible, mournful melody. And he was walking toward me, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. I ran. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face, my camera banging against my chest. I could hear the pipes behind me, following, the music never stopping, never fading. And underneath the melody, I heard something else. Footsteps. Not the normal sound of boots on earth, but a dragging, scraping sound, like something being pulled across the ground. I burst back onto the main trail, gasping for air, and stopped to look back. The forest was dark and silent. No pipes, no figure, nothing, just the distant roar of the rapids and the whisper of wind through the trees. I stood there trying to catch my breath, trying to convince myself it had been my imagination, when I noticed something that made my stomach drop. I was not where I thought I was. The trail I was standing on did not look familiar. It was narrower, less maintained, and it ran right along the edge of the canyon. And I mean right along the edge, less than 3 feet from where I stood, the ground dropped away into nothing, a sheer vertical drop to the churning white water 100 feet below. One more step in the darkness and I would have gone over. That is when I understood. The pipes were not chasing me. They were herding me, driving me toward the edge, toward the same fate that had claimed the piper himself over a century ago. I carefully backed away from the rim and found my way to the main parking area. My tripod was still there by the trail where I had left it, my equipment untouched. But when I checked the photos on my camera, hoping to find some proof of what I had seen, every image I had taken in those woods was black. Completely black, like I had been shooting with the lens cap on. Every photo except one. The last image showed the clearing with the grave marker, and standing behind the cross, barely visible in the shadows, was the figure of the piper. His empty eye sockets stared directly at the camera, and in the corner of the frame, you could just make out the edge of the canyon, mere feet from where I had been standing. I left Miles Canyon that night and drove straight back to Whitehorse. I needed answers. I needed to know who Malcolm Fraser was and what had happened to him. The next morning, I went to the local historical society and found a researcher who specialized in the Klondike Gold Rush era. When I mentioned the name and the date on the grave marker, her expression changed. She recognized it immediately. She told me the story. In 1898, a Scottish surveying party had been mapping the canyon in preparation for the gold rush stampeders who would need to navigate the dangerous rapids. Malcolm Fraser had been their piper, hired to keep morale up during the long, difficult work. One evening in October, he wandered away from camp to practice his pipes. His companions heard the music drifting through the forest for about an hour, and then it stopped suddenly. They searched for him all night. They found his body the next morning at the bottom of the canyon. The official report said he had gotten too close to the edge in the darkness and fallen. But his fellow surveyors told a different story. They said that when they found his bagpipes near the rim, still clutched in his cold hands, the instrument was covered in claw marks. Deep gouges in the wood that could not be explained. And they said that for weeks afterward, they would hear his pipes playing at night, always near the most dangerous sections of the canyon. Always near the places where the drop was steepest and the rocks below were sharpest. Over the years, dozens of hikers have reported hearing the phantom piper. And according to the records the researcher showed me, every single person who followed the sound and ventured off the trail was found either dead at the bottom of the canyon or standing at the very edge, unaware of how close they had come to falling. The locals believe the piper is not trying to harm people. He is trying to warn them. When you hear the pipes, you are too close to the edge. You are in danger. And if you follow the sound instead of running from it, he will lead you to safety or to your death, depending on whether you understand the warning. But here's what keeps me awake at night. Here's what I cannot explain. When I was running through those woods, terrified, convinced I was being hunted, the piper was not chasing me onto the trail. He was chasing me away from something else. Because when I finally looked at that last photograph, really studied it, I saw something I had missed the first time. There were other figures in the shadows behind the piper, dark shapes barely visible between the trees, and they were not trying to warn me. They were waiting. I have not been back to Miles Canyon. I will never go back. But last week, I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound that stopped my heart. Faint and distant, barely audible through my bedroom window, I heard bagpipes playing. That same mournful Scottish lament. And when I looked outside, I saw nothing but darkness and the normal lights of the Seattle suburbs. But the music continued for almost 5 minutes before fading away. I live nowhere near a canyon. There is no danger here, no cliffs, no whitewater rapids. So why would the phantom piper come all this way? Why would he play his warning here, in a place where there's no edge to fall from? Unless the danger is not about falling. Unless the edge he's warning me about is something else entirely. Something I brought back with me from those woods. Something that followed me home. Tonight, I heard the pipes again, closer this time, right outside my apartment door. And I know, with a certainty that fills me with unspeakable dread, that the next time I hear them, they will be inside. The warning is over. Whatever was waiting in those shadows has found me. And unlike Malcolm Fraser, I will not have the mercy of a quick fall into the darkness. The pipes are playing right now as I write this. I can hear them in my living room. Story 10 to 1982 Whitehorse Blackout and the Shadow People Invasion. I was standing in total darkness when I realized the shadow moving past my window was not supposed to be there, and that terrifying moment changed everything I thought I knew about what was real. It was November 14th, 1982, and Whitehorse had been without power for 6 hours. No lights, no heat, no explanation from the authorities. Just darkness so complete you could not see your own hand in front of your face. I was 28 years old, working as a night manager at a truck stop on the Alaska Highway just outside the city. When the blackout hit at 7:43 that evening, every light in Whitehorse went out at exactly the same moment. Not a rolling blackout, not a gradual failure. 1 second the city was lit up against the northern night. The next second it was gone. Vanished into darkness like someone had flipped a switch on the entire region. The emergency generators at the truck stop kicked in after a few seconds, giving us dim lighting in the main building, but looking out the windows into that absolute blackness felt wrong. Unnatural. Like the darkness was not just an absence of light but something physical, something present and waiting. The first reports came over the CB radio around 8:30. Truckers calling in from different points along the highway, all of them saying the same creepy thing. They were seeing movement in the darkness. Figures crossing the road, running between the trees, moving too fast to be human. One driver, a guy named Carl, who I had known for years and who was not the type to make things up, said he had nearly hit something on the highway. He described it as human-shaped but wrong, moving on all fours one moment and upright the next, crossing 4 lanes of road in maybe 2 seconds. When his headlights hit it, he saw what looked like eyes reflecting the light, but they were not animal eyes. They glowed with their own illumination, a pale greenish color that he said made him feel sick just looking at them. Carl pulled into the truck stop 20 minutes later, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold his coffee. His truck had scratches down the driver's side, deep gouges in the metal that had not been there before, and he swore he had not hit anything or scraped against any barrier. Something had clawed his vehicle while he was driving. By 10 o'clock, the phone lines that were still working were jammed with calls. The few battery-powered radios people had were picking up scattered reports from the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, telling people to stay indoors, lock their doors, and avoid looking outside. That last part was what made my blood run cold. Avoid looking outside. Why would the police tell people not to look out their own windows? What was out there in that terrifying darkness that they did not want us to see? I tried calling my girlfriend Sarah, who lived in town, but the lines were dead. No dial tone, no static, just empty silence like the phone system had been completely severed. The isolation was crushing. We were cut off from the city, cut off from help, sitting in our small pool of generator light while something unknown moved in the darkness beyond our walls. The temperature was dropping fast. November in the Yukon gets down to 20 below, and without power, people in town were going to freeze. But the authorities were telling everyone to stay inside. Whatever was happening, they considered it more dangerous than the cold. Around 11, a family pulled into the truck stop in a station wagon. The father was driving, his wife in the passenger seat, 2 kids in the back. They looked terrified. The man, his name was Robert, told me they had tried to drive out of Whitehorse heading south, trying to get somewhere with power. About 10 miles out of town, their headlights had picked up figures standing in the middle of the road. He said there were dozens of them, maybe more, just standing there in a line across both lanes, not moving. When he slowed down to see what was blocking the road, the figures had turned to look at the car in perfect unison, like they were all controlled by the same mind. That was when Robert saw their eyes. Glowing, pale green, dozens of pairs of eyes all fixed on his vehicle. He had thrown the car in reverse and driven backward for half a mile before turning around, and the whole time he could see those figures in his rearview mirror, not chasing but watching, just watching with those horrible glowing eyes. His wife was crying. The kids were silent, staring at nothing, and when I looked at them closely I realized they were in shock. Whatever they had seen out there had broken something in them. I made the family stay in the truck stop office where it was warmest. By midnight, we had 12 people sheltering with us. More truckers, a couple who had been driving through and gotten stranded, a RCMP officer named Davidson who had been on patrol when the blackout hit. Davidson was the one who told us what the police were really seeing in Whitehorse. He said the official logs would never reflect what happened that night, that they had already been told to describe the incidents as mass hysteria or panic related to the blackout. But the truth was disturbing and impossible to explain. Starting about an hour after the power failed, people across the city had started calling in reports of shadow people. That is what everyone was calling them. Humanoid figures made of darkness, moving through the streets at impossible speeds, looking into windows, testing doors. They were not solid, not exactly, but they were not transparent either. They existed in the darkness like they were part of it, like the blackout had opened a door and let something through from somewhere else. Davidson said he had seen them himself. He had been driving down Main Street when his headlights swept across a group of them, maybe 8 or 10, standing in front of a shopping center. They had scattered when the light hit them, moving so fast they blurred, vanishing into alleys and shadows in the space of a heartbeat. But not before he got a good look. They were roughly human in shape but elongated, too tall, with limbs that bent at angles that were not quite right. And those eyes, always those glowing eyes, the only part of them that seemed truly solid and real. He said other officers had tried to approach them, had even fired warning shots, but the shadow people did not react to sound or light or anything else. They just kept moving through the city, looking, searching for something. Davidson's radio had picked up dozens of calls from terrified residents. People reporting that the shadow people were trying to get into houses, scratching at doors, pressing against windows. One woman had called in screaming that they were on her roof, that she could hear them walking around up there, and then her line had gone dead. The most chilling thing Davidson told us was about the pattern. The shadow people were not moving randomly. They were conducting a systematic search, going street by street, house by house, like they were looking for something specific or someone specific. And wherever they concentrated their search, the darkness seemed to deepen, seemed to become thicker and more oppressive. He said there were areas of Whitehorse now where even high-powered flashlights could not penetrate more than a few feet, where the darkness swallowed light like it was alive. I asked him what the RCMP thought these things were, where they came from. He just shook his head and said nobody knew, that theories ranged from mass hallucination to some kind of atmospheric phenomenon to things he would not even repeat because they sounded too crazy. But I could see in his eyes that he believed it was the last option, the crazy option. Something from outside our normal reality had come through during the blackout, and now it was loose in Whitehorse. Around 1 a.m, the generator at the truck stop started making a horrible grinding noise. I went to check on it, stepping outside into the freezing darkness. The moment I left the building, I felt it. A presence, massive and aware, pressing down on everything. The air was wrong, thicker than it should be, and it carried a smell like ozone and rot. My flashlight beam seemed weaker outside, the darkness pushing back against it. I made my way to the generator shed, every nerve in my body screaming at me to get back inside. That was when I saw my first shadow person. It was standing about 30 feet away, at the edge of the parking lot, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. Tall, maybe 7 feet, impossibly thin, and so dark it seemed to absorb what little light there was. Its eyes were fixed on me, glowing with that sickly pale green light, and I felt a wave of fear so intense I nearly collapsed. This was not human. This was not anything that should exist. It moved slightly, a jerking motion like it was deciding whether to approach, and I saw that its joints bent backward, that its fingers were too long, that its head tilted at an angle no human neck could manage. I backed toward the generator shed, never taking my eyes off the thing, and it followed. Not quickly but deliberately, maintaining that 30-foot distance, watching me with what felt like curiosity or hunger. I got inside the shed and slammed the door, my heart hammering so hard I thought I might have a heart attack. The generator was overheating, the oil filter clogged. I worked on it with shaking hands, listening to sounds outside that I could not identify. Scratching on the metal walls, footsteps that came in irregular rhythms, a low humming sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. When I finally got the generator stabilized and stepped back outside, the shadow person was gone. But I could feel that it was still watching from somewhere in the darkness, that they were all watching, all waiting for something. I ran back to the main building and locked the door behind me. Everyone inside could tell something had happened. I must have looked as terrified as I felt. The next few hours were a nightmare of waiting. We huddled together in the truck stop, listening to the CB radio reports getting more and more disturbing. The shadow people were becoming bolder. They were no longer just watching. People across Whitehorse were reporting that the creatures were trying to communicate, making sounds that were almost words, patterns of taps and scratches on walls that repeated like Morse code. One ham radio operator claimed he had recorded some of the sounds, and when he played them backward, they formed phrases in English, the same phrase over and over. Let us in. Let us in. Let us in. But that could not be verified. And by 3 a.m, All radio communications had become garbled and useless, filled with static and strange echoing voices that were not from any known broadcaster. We were in complete isolation now, cut off from any information about what was happening in the city or whether help was coming. The kids were crying. The adults were not much better. Davidson kept his service weapon drawn, though I do not know what he thought he could shoot in that darkness. Around 4:30, something hit the side of the truck stop building. A massive impact that shook the walls and knocked supplies off the shelves. Then another hit, and another, coming from different sides, like we were surrounded and under attack. We could hear them out there now, dozens of footsteps circling the building, moving fast, and that humming sound growing louder, resonating in our chests and making it hard to breathe. The generator lights flickered. I thought we were going to lose power, thought we would be plunged into darkness with those things right outside, and the fear of that was worse than anything I had ever experienced. But the lights held. The impact stopped. The footsteps faded away, and then, at exactly 6:01 in the morning, the power came back on. Every light in the truck stop surged to full brightness. The radio crackled back to life with normal broadcasts. And when we looked outside as the dawn started to break, the shadow people were gone. Completely and utterly gone, like they had never been there at all. Whitehorse woke up to an unexplained 18-hour blackout and hundreds of people with the same impossible story. We had all seen them, the shadow people with glowing eyes, moving through the darkness, searching for something, trying to get inside our homes and buildings. But when the official reports came out, they called it mass hysteria brought on by the stress of the blackout and the extreme cold. They said people had panicked in the darkness and their imaginations had run wild. The scratches on vehicles and buildings were attributed to wind-blown debris. The systematic nature of the sightings was explained away as people influencing each other through radio communications and shared fear. The RCMP logs from that night were classified, sealed under some emergency protocol that nobody would explain. Officer Davidson was transferred to Vancouver 2 weeks later. When I tried to contact him months after, I was told he had resigned from the force and his whereabouts were unknown. The family that had seen the shadow people blocking the road left Whitehorse and never came back. Most of the truckers who were at my stop that night changed their routes to avoid the area. I stayed in Whitehorse for another year, but I could never shake the feeling that something had changed during that blackout, that some barrier had weakened and never quite sealed properly again. There were more reports over the months that followed, though less frequent and less intense. People seeing figures in the darkness during winter nights, glowing eyes in the woods, strange scratching sounds on houses when the power went out. The authorities dismissed it all, but those of us who had been there knew better. We knew what we had seen. We knew that for 18 hours, something from somewhere else had invaded our city, had walked our streets, had looked through our windows searching for a way to stay. I moved back to the lower 48 in 1984. I have not been back to Whitehorse since, but I still think about that night, about those shadow people and their glowing eyes and the way they moved through darkness like they owned it. I think about what Officer Davidson said, about how they seemed to be searching for something specific. I wonder if they found it. I wonder if they are still there, waiting in the spaces between light and dark, patient and hungry and ready to come through again the next time the barriers fail. Because here's what terrifies me most. What keeps me awake on dark winter nights? The blackout was never explained. 18 hours of total power failure across an entire region with no technical cause ever identified. The official report said equipment malfunction, but the equipment was fine when they checked it. Something had turned off the lights, deliberately and completely, creating the perfect conditions for those things to come through. And if it happened once, it can happen again. Somewhere, in some other city during some other blackout, people might be looking out their windows right now and seeing those same glowing eyes in the darkness, those same impossible figures moving too fast to be real. The shadow people are still out there. They are waiting for the next door to open. They are patient. They have all the time in the world. And the next time the lights go out and stay out, you need to remember what happened in Whitehorse. Lock your doors, close your curtains, and whatever you do, do not look outside into the darkness, because if you see those glowing eyes staring back at you, it means they have found what they were searching for, and it might just be you.